the real e pluribus unum. I'm embarrassed to say I never actually known what e pluribus unum means. Out of many one. It makes sense if you just never apparently even pondered. But regarding the challenge he said, when I was the bishop of North Carolina, a reporter asked me what the biggest challenge facing the church was. I answered, we're wrestling with sexuality now. We know that, but I think the greater challenge is this: how do we make e pluribus unum, out of many one, real without obliterating anybody? That's not just the church's challenge, it is our national challenge, it's the world's challenge. How do we walk together as brothers and sisters, united by some ancient and venerated values and hopes, when we also have significant differences and disagreements? I think we all can relate to the challenge. And what observations in terms of rising up to that challenge did you maybe get from this chapter? Hey, that's pretty quick, Clay. It's almost kind of jaunty.
One thing that came to mind when I was reading it is those of us that have kind of struggled through it, find our way on this journey. It's like, oh, well, like in Gloria Dei, the pastor has his collar with the rainbow on it. You've kind of made your statement and where you are, and you don't want to rehash all the battles again. Just saw some Civil War sites, and even that's difficult. It's like, I don't want to go relive battles once we've kind of found our way and have a peace with what we're doing. And so it's hard to read all of that again, and knowing around the world, in Africa especially, it's still a hot item, and it divides people, and some of us prefer being united.
Yeah, I had a few visits with a couple of our different tour. I don't know what exactly the positions were of our group leaders, Dan, but their stance on homosexuality in the church in Ethiopia and in Tanzania is there's nothing to talk about. And he was good, but we talked, and then still we got along. We served together, and I guess I was so that whole story with the Episcopal and the Anglican community, where the first vote, right? Remember with the first vote, can we commit to walk together no matter strongly we disagree about what we're about to do? Really, we might use that sometime if we're needed. I mean,
that was a moment of hope for me.
Yeah. And a wonderful thing. Before they got down to the nitty gritty of the things they did disagree about, will we commit? And then the other thing about his story of how you went from maybe not even meeting eye contact with people you disagree with before, by the time you get to the end, you've washed each other's feet and had meals with each other, and it's just harder. It's harder to be an enemy with someone than when you get to know them, right?
And I hope I'm not off track on anything, but I was on page 206, and I think this is important in our society because we don't follow through on it. It says in the middle of the first full paragraph, about the third sentence, it says, because prayer, real prayer, is both contemplative and active. And I think that we spend a lot of time thinking we can just say a prayer and then not do anything. But you have to follow it up by action, or you're just making noise.
Yeah, very good. I mean, sometimes the answer to the prayer is what the Spirit prods you to do, right?
Right, and I think it's easy to say a prayer because it's words, and it's harder to put your words into action in even teeny weeny little ways, like not being mad at your neighbor like I am that parks all his work stuff in my street, and I should go talk to him, but I'm trying to work up to doing it. I go to the police instead.
Got it.
Got it.
I had not realized until I read this book that there are 85 million Episcopalians in the world. Half of them are in Africa. And I'm sure that that's why he is on the forefront of getting people together, because they can understand each other. They can talk to each other. And that makes a whale of a difference. Most of the people I know who are church people are not Black. And that's why we're having a hard time. The statement in here that the largest hour of
Segregation.
right is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and has been for years. And that's why I think Curry can.
Martin Luther King Jr. observed that, didn't he? Wasn't that quoting him?
Right. And that can make a big difference. The fact that Curry can talk to people and can be understood by people around the world. So it isn't just the business of love. I think it's the business of understanding who they are and where they're coming from.
Which might be part of loving them. Right? Taking the time to understand who people are as opposed to dismissing them with our first category that we know who they are without even knowing their name.
I mean, we Lutherans couldn't do that thing. Have that many people who are not of Nordic background.
Well, the Lutheran Church in Africa has some really rapidly growing areas as well.
Growing.
Yeah. I was just so impressed with the journey with Curry and the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's a very hopeful story too. On one hand, he presided over that process by which they were censured. Is that the word? In some manner of discipline, but not the breaking of the communion, which would have been yeah. So, and then afterwards, when they're sitting together, getting ready for the wedding. How is it that the two of you are sitting here together and will be together at this wedding when you've had, the significant disagreement? And they both gave similar answers. He said something like this: "This is my brother. We follow Jesus. He teaches us the way of love. He didn't teach us the way of agreement." That love dominates our relationship, not our agreements or our disagreements. He didn't teach the way of agreement, not the way of love, right? Which is, he also didn't tell you to like your neighbor. He told you to love your neighbor. Those aren't the same thing. And Jesus talked about love. He was talking about a commitment and a way of life. That's kind of related to the feet too. Love is a path you walk, not a feeling in your heart necessarily. Emotions come and go, but when Jesus of Nazareth tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, the love he's demonstration is a determination and commitment to do what is best and right and good, as well as you can figure it out for the other. Let's all stop worrying about whether we like each other and choose to believe instead that we're capable of doing good together. I didn't realize that St. Augustine had been in England. I thought I was touching some deep roots when I was preaching in Luther's church, but my goodness. And Luther's church actually went back to the 1200s, but talking about things they've had in that church since the 500s. What's the Book of Gospels? What does that mean? He talked about the Book of Gospels from Augustine that's been used since Augustine.
We don't know.
I believe it came from the Pope. Didn't they say that the Pope sent it?
The Pope sent the crosier.
But I thought later on in the process he sent the Gospels too, for their closing ceremony or something.
Okay, maybe so. And by the way, I was really impressed by the Pope in this story too.
I know.
Gosh, over here, Clay. Adele, when you do that at home, does he come running like that?
See how fast he is.
Speaking of the Pope in the paper, they're talking about he's considering going to Ukraine. So that gives you hope too, that universal, the people of faith could work in unison, even though, again, we would not agree on everything that we all stand for. But when it comes to nitty gritty and major issues like war and peace, we can come together. And I thought that was a bit of the appreciation of the Archbishop of Canterbury and Michael Curry. Like, this isn't the biggest issue facing us today, sexuality. It's a big issue, but not the biggest. And that together we can work for good. And don't let it stop us get off on the sidetrack when we have bigger kettle of fish to fry.
Yeah. That was the ELCA's take clear back when we finally approved our document. It didn't work for everybody. I mean, there are people who said the answer is no, we can't work together. We can't do good together if we're going to allow this. And the ELCA was I think often misunderstood. When people, the phone calls and letters I got for so long, but one of them was that the ELCA said you had to bless homosexual unions in your church, and actually that wasn't what it said. The ELCA said you may. Follow your conscience, love your neighbor, and follow your conscience and the Word of God the best you believe you can, and respect that some others may be led to a different path on particular issues than you. Well, that was the chart they tried, but we lost a bunch, unfortunately.
And on the bottom of that same page, on 206, I think it says just exactly what you just said. It says, to love my brothers and sisters does not mean we have to agree. But maybe agreeing to love is the greatest agreement and the one that ultimately matters because it makes a future possible. I mean, I think that just sums up what everybody had just said. This is the deal. If I talk, she talks. Got it?
Just kind of an incidental thought, but as I was reading through this, the word of love, of course, is used all the way through the article. And I got to thinking, how do you define love? So I went to my big old Oxford English Dictionary, which is huge. And there are 24 definitions of love in that dictionary. And about 10 of them, or 8 of them, refer to what we would call sexual love. And the others are more like understanding or agreement. And I think maybe I would, in many instances, like to substitute the word respect. And I think most people can understand the word respect for another individual who is not related to you. But I think people are afraid of the word love because of the connotations of what it means. And maybe that's not a problem for most people, but it came through to me reading it in this book all the time. How do you love your neighbor? But you have to respect your neighbor. So that's my contribution.
Neil, did you have something to say? No.
I will say, Connie has the most impressive notes of anyone here.
Great, but chapter 10, the Great Relationship Revival. By the way, I was going to comment on the Pope going to Ukraine. I mean, you think the Lutherans are the only ones who ever had a split with Rome? I mean, 500 years earlier, wasn't it in the 10-somethings that the Eastern and Western Church split, and that was ugly. And so for the Pope to go back and then to be received, see, I mean, how that goes. But it's a hopeful sign. Chief Sitting Bull, let us put our minds together and see what life we can make for our children. All right, so it talks about relationships as opposed to demonizing people whom we know nothing about. Begins with that very ugly story of a Trump supporter, white, jumps out and punches a guy in the face, black man. Afterwards, said on video he deserved it. The next time we see him, we might have to kill him. We don't know who he is. He might be with a terrorist organization. And of course, he jumps on the language, we don't know who he is. And but the reconciliation that came beyond that was also extremely impressive. He later apologized and then was invited out by the man he punched, and they had lunch together. And all of a sudden you have a couple of humans. You know, the first one was the I-it relationship with that black man at our rally. And then it became a person.
I love how he says, I met you in the street and the same thing occurred. I would have said, go home. One of us will get hurt. And that's what I would have said. But we're caught up in a political mess today, and you and me, we got to heal our country together. That's hopeful.
I don't remember the details, but the shooting that there was at an Amish community.
Right, we had a book about that at Lent a while ago.
Yeah, and how the community, I mean, it was just part of their culture to forgive. And they put it into practice, and that is an awesome kind of thing, and it's just part of who they are. Wouldn't that be nice if that was part of who we are, you know, and that we would be able to love each other?
Hi, I've been reading along, even though this is my first time actually being here. My name is Sarah, and this chapter is really hard for me because I have several different family members that like we kind of cut off relationship over arguments, and it's very interesting because the kind of culminating moment was often like a political argument. But there was always like a lot of hurt in the past before that. So for example, my uncle, there was a a shooting with like police brutality and race and all that stuff, and we were having a conversation about it, and it turned into a whole thing where he was bringing up all this stuff in the past, like family members that had been abused and hadn't been believed, and authority, and I just don't know how to resolve these relationships. I just really don't. We don't. It's like there's so much depth to the disagreement. It goes beyond just a political thing. It's like a whole way of seeing the world, and I don't know how to resolve it, and it makes me really sad. Because it was like we were talking about the politics, but really we were talking about the family history, and the family history is still not resolved, and he still doesn't believe, in the experience of people in my family who have been hurt, and I don't know.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, you remind us this is in the real world we're talking about. And not as easy maybe as a book might make it sound, but
It's inspiring.
Sarah and her family are our newest members. They've officially not been received yet, but they've turned in the paperwork. So Dan and Megan, you know the paper.
Sarah, what's your last name?
Alderson Murphy and Bobby, my husband, came a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
We have kids, so we don't switch off.
Bobby's the one who added the fourth word for love, Dan. He's a ordained Presbyterian pastor, so he's actually joining as an associate member to keep his credentials in good order with the Presbyterian Church. And then three little ones, Theo and Lydia and Catherine, yeah, whom we will be baptizing sometime soon. Wonderful.
On page 224, I liked where he said, he likes to ask participants a question. For a particular issue, what is the story of your life that brought you to that conclusion? So when you're discussing something, to change it to be a story so that maybe there's a little more understanding.
So this book has the premise that working together pervades everything that we need to do. That's hard to see sometimes when the focus is on individualism so much today. And I was wondering how you get it focused back to that the reason we have government is to work together. And that seems not to be, it's about individual rights these days. And then also I was reminded about my uncle's project. I don't know, it was when the USSR was in power, and he said the only way we'll have world peace is to have relationships not through the power brokers or the people with power, but communities aligned. So he had prepared a book that was never published about matching communities in the USSR with the communities in the United States to develop relationships at a grassroots level rather than at a power level.
And that you do see that in Ukraine, because I hear a lot of people, one spouse is Ukraine and one is from Russia. And so it is true that there's those connections. And I think that might be some of the reason that Russia has not mowed them down, is because there's people who are saying, wait, yeah. So Bishop Curry says, our stories have power. They have power to change how people understand the world, but even before that, they have the power to heal the storyteller. I'm thinking of Sarah's uncle, that's Bobby, by the way. That's the prayer for people who can tell stories. If they tell their stories and people hear their stories, possibly they'll be able to work through that. But it's a long slog to get through all that. I think that's kind of the hard part about this chapter, is that it doesn't happen overnight. And so that it's just, you got to listen and you have to understand.
And I just want to add, are you next? Because I got the mic, so be thinking, because you're next. At the bottom of page 224, I think this is what we need to remember. It says, our stories are the song of our souls. And I think if we realize how deep some people's stories are and where they're coming from, that will help us to understand why they do what they do, whether we feel it's right or wrong. And if we approach them, I'm thinking about my neighbor this whole time I'm saying this, what I can do to help me be better like this book. I mean, if we understand what their story and they can understand, or at least are aware of it, then I think that's the first step to moving
What you should
forward.
do is knock on his door and say, listen, Buster, you have to read this book.
I know. I think I need that, but I know where the book would end up. In my face. This neighbor comes to my door and threatens me, I'm telling you. I'm turning him in, which is why I keep doing it.
Yeah, but 222 is a pretty good description of our society, I think, these days, right? America in the last decades has essentially segregated itself, not primarily along racial lines, but into communities of like-mindedness. We got Republican leading zip codes, Democratic leading zip codes, 52245. And independent zip codes. Apart from residential segregation, media segregates us as well. Simply put, the people who watch Sean Hannity tonight are not going to turn to NMSNBC to watch Rachel Maddow. Cable news and the rise of social media have made it possible to consume news 24/7 and never hear an opinion that differs from your own. Right? Madeleine Albright said, didn't she die recently?
Yes.
Yeah. Instead of conspiring with the like-minded, we need to spend more time learning from those we consider wrong-headed. And I can be as guilty of that as anybody, although I've really tried consciously. I mean, I don't turn on Sean Hannity. Then again, I don't really watch Rachel Maddow, but on my news feed, you can check my phone. It's got PBR. In fairness, I have not had a Pabst Blue Ribbon in decades. There was time. PBS, IPR, NPR, that's what I was looking for. And Fox News and the Washington Post, New York Times. But I mean, I try not to get into this one tunnel, but I still know when I'm reading Fox News, I go in with a different attitude. Although I have learned that Fox News is not the same thing as Fox Opinions. It's still not my favorite news, but they actually were in time to present some really credible news. What I also find is that both CNN and Fox News find it newsworthy to talk about what a lousy organization the other one is. Really, I mean, CNN will have a story, you can't believe what this Fox reporter just said, and vice versa. I don't read any of those. It's like, when did that become news? Walter Cronkite saying, you know that Chet Huntley? I can't believe what he said.
I read recently that if you took ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times, and added up all their readers and viewers, it would be about 1/30 of the followers of websites that I've never heard of any particular day that are putting out these conspiracies. So all of their influence is negated way over by a few crackpot websites, in my opinion.
One more reinforcement of his idea of telling the story. And this is from the Episcopal background. So the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa has a relationship with a very small country in Africa, Swaziland. And Swaziland would be considered conservative on all things, sexuality, women's ordination, all of that kind of thing. And so we began a relationship with them, and we would have visits back and forth. But predominantly when we would send people to Swaziland, there would be a project, a well, building a church or a home for the pastor or something like that. And it was interesting because we would also send ordained women on these trips. So instead of going over and telling them, you really should consider this because this is the right thing to do and all of that, ordained women would be working with women from Swaziland and building a project side by side. And that mutual project allowed communication, maybe that would be informal as opposed to this us versus them mentality. And the happy news is over about 30 years, Swaziland, which is their own kind of, particular branch of the Anglican world, chose to ordain women over time, and then had a female bishop in the last cycle, she's no longer the bishop, but she, you know, over 30 years, they had a relationship. And this gets back to having lunch together or having communication and not just setting it up in a me versus you format. But I want to get to know you. Tell me your story. And I don't know of anything else quite like it in Africa. I hope there's some more like that.
I think a lot of times when we label people or categorize them, we do a tremendous injustice. You can call somebody a, quote, a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, but that's to narrow the focus on the things that they believe necessarily. And not everybody within a group is 100% agreeable with everybody else in the group. I mean, you see that in any group. It's a lot easier to demonize somebody when you can put a label on them or make them a them instead of or an it instead of a them. And I'm guilty of the same thing. I try not to do that, but it's sometimes you just want to say those damn fill in the blank.
Pastors.
Pastor. I wasn't going to say that because we partnered on the golf course sometimes. So I know you as a person too. It's just that, but I think, and I think a lot of times when we get into conflicts and world wars and things like that, it's, you know, the other side is evil. Well, they probably think that our side is evil, but that's how you demonize them, take the faces away from the people. And a lot of times it's not the people that are the evil ones, that may be the leaders that create the issues, and it's not the people in the groups, the majority of the people that actually feel that way. And I think we have to be careful with that. I think when you say love your neighbor, there are a lot of the neighbors that we like too, that we should be liking as well as loving them.
No, I was going like that, I did my neighbor.
To piggyback on Greg, I think that sometimes when I was counseling couples, we'd have that anger, frustration, and getting the person to tell their story, which I thought was really good in this book. You sometimes can't do that, I discovered, unless you can change the language. And oftentimes I would, when somebody was really angry, I'd say, so tell me more about what you're disappointed in. Because oftentimes what really is behind anger is disappointment or loneliness or depression. And when you change that language, then it doesn't become so much of an us and them thing. And I think that's always the hard part, is getting past the anger, I think. But I just really found that part about the story, and the guy that brought people together. I think a friend of his brought groups together that were just wanting to understand each other. And it just occurred to me, I think I'm going to send Rachel Maddow an email and say, you and Sean Hannity ought to start your own show.
I just wanted to comment that about 5 years ago, I was at Amherst College out in the East Coast. I was a guest of a friend who was a graduate, and I went to a panel of some of their alum, and one happened to be a retired, and he must not have been Speaker of the House, but he was very high up in the workings of Congress. And so what I'm going to say is, what I'm going to say is what he paraphrased, I'll paraphrase what he said in terms of He said, when I first worked in Washington, decades ago, he said a lot of our senators and our House of Representatives, the whole House, a lot of them were living in Washington during the sessions, actually had a place to live with their families. Their families' children were going to school there. He said over the last 10 years or so, for whatever reason, he said, we are now finding that the people are walking out of the sessions and they're getting on their, going to getting the taxis and going to the airport and flying home because that's where their families live now. So he said there is not that day-to-day, face-to-face interaction or spontaneous, like, hey, why don't you come over for a barbecue? Or, why don't you come over for a cup of coffee or a glass of wine? And it was a perspective that I never would have thought of. But that was something he said prevents this, getting to know someone on the other side and listening to their story in an informal manner.
I try to be hopeful of our folks in Washington. I imagine that they have some of those conversations and they just don't have the, I don't know what word I'm looking for. They can't stand up and say that publicly because then when they go out publicly, they have to posture for their base. But my hope is that sometime behind the scenes, they actually are talking to each other. But it's a pretty low bar.
Well, I'm interested if when Charles Robinson asked, what is the story of your life that brought you to that conclusion? Did you spend any time thinking about that? When you decided something about a social issue, what is it that brought you to that conclusion? For example, what I'm aware of is this is really simple-minded, but when I was a kid, I mean, Sunday school said that Jesus loves everybody and you should love everybody. And that was kind of okay. And I didn't, obviously I grew up in a totally white place. But the thing that I do remember is that in the middle of the early race riots, I said to my mom, why is everybody so mad? And my mother said, I don't know, they're all people. And so that just kind of confirmed my little brain that there wasn't any reason for this to be going. And so at that point, then I kind of stopped. No. Anyway, so that was one. And the other one was I detasseled corn many, many years. And one time my crew boss had a girlfriend and they kind of were crew boss together and they were lesbians. And everybody was just, oh my gosh, you're lesbian. I had no idea what the deal was, right? Because I had a real good friend, a female good friend, so they're just really good friends. What's the deal here, And so it took me a while, and my friend's mother said, they're going to think you're lesbians when we went to college together. And I'm going, I don't know what the big deal is. And so, I really, I spent a delightfully unaware childhood and teens. And I really think that then when I got old enough to start figuring things out, it was like, well, that's not a big deal. Why is that such a big deal? So that's kind of my story. I also worked with a young man who was gay when I was in the Lutheran student movement. That's a national movement. And he was the person I was supposed to be working with for my region. And he was gay, and it just, I knew that, and that was all. He didn't like the fact that I ate my eggs runny, but other than that, we were fine. And so we actually, he was actually in our wedding, and we had a fine time. So anyway, I don't have any specific thing when my mind was changed, because my mind just seemed to be kind of blankly, not analytical, when I was forming those kinds of decisions. That's my story. It's not much of a story.
I want to say my story just briefly. My grandma on my dad's side, my paternal grandmother, every time I left her house, she would say to me, watch out for the other person, watch out for those other guys. She didn't mean that as a warning. She meant that you watch out for them, take care of them.
I kind of wonder what couples are very divided politically, how they get along day to day during this time we're going through. I think that'd be a real challenge.
Tell Kellyanne and, Kellyanne, is that her name?
Yeah.
George? How's that work? My wife likes your yolks hard too. I just don't understand it. What's wrong with those people? I like mine running.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
He didn't like going out to some restaurants with me because I'd have that for supper. And then say, you're just gonna leave that, gonna run all over, isn't it? Yes, it is.
Casey prefers runny eggs too, by the way.
I like the idea about the stories and how they can help us understand each other. And it reminds me of when Bob and I lived in Boston, our church was participating in something called the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, which was basically a community organizing group. And I didn't really know what community organizing was, but basically it's like you have all these, they call them one-to-ones, and basically people inside one church and then between different churches or different groups will have conversations one-on-one where you share like the most important stories of your life, like just things that have changed you, like like for me, my daughter going to the NICU or whatever, like that has shaped my feelings about healthcare and parenting and all kinds of things. And so you share like some of these important stories, and then you just kind of like listen to the other person, and then you have a meeting with a larger group of people where you talk about, here are some of the things we heard, and you listen for patterns and you listen for things that come up, and then you have another bigger meeting where you talk about the things that came up in your smaller house meetings, and then as a whole group, the whole organization decides we need to focus on more affordable housing, or we need to focus on improving access to healthcare, or we need to get more green space in the city, because that is what came up in people's stories. And so that's how community organizing works. And it was really amazing to see. And again and again, it was like, it doesn't come from people deciding what needs to happen. It came from people telling each other their stories and then listening for patterns. And I thought that was really beautiful.
Very hopeful. The guy who met with us got fired. Being a little too abrasive.
We had that in Davenport when I was at a church there. Yeah.
All right, well, time to Sunday school get over?
Oh, 9:15.
10:15. Okay.
Never get that time right. I've not adjusted.
All right. Well, thank you all. We'll have one more week. A reminder, Wednesday, you're welcome to come for soup supper served by our Tuesday morning men's Bible study group. Right?
Yes.
We're in. Okay.
And this is Cheryl. If you're going to the Easter breakfast, let her know.
It's just much easier for planners if they have some sense of how many are coming. So if you can do that, you can do it online too, but you can just walk over to Cheryl and say, we're in. All right. Thank you. Go in peace and love your neighbor.
Thank you.
You know,